turns out she had a slight stroke.
I did.
She couldn't move. Over the door to the train.
And I did not know you at the time.
But we'd been on the same stage together and no harm.
For 30 years, one man decided who got to matter on television. And when he decided you didn't anymore, nothing happened. No warning call. No explanation. No goodbye on air. Just silence. Your name simply stopped coming up. 7 people found this out the hard way. One of them became a legend. One of them became a movie icon. One of them ruled Las Vegas. One of them was loved like family until the day she wasn't. Each of them crossed a line only one man could see, and none of them ever got a second chance. This is the story of 7 careers that hit an invisible wall, and the one man powerful enough to end them without ever raising his voice. Orson Welles. He was not just a guest. He was practically a myth walking through the studio doors. By the time Orson Welles stepped onto that stage, he had already directed one of the greatest films ever made before he turned 26. He had convinced an entire nation that Martians were invading with nothing but his voice on the radio. When he spoke, people leaned in, because it sounded like the voice of something bigger than television. And there was one more reason this man mattered more than almost anyone else in that building. He and the host shared a secret language. Long before either of them was famous, both of them had fallen in love with the exact same thing as boys. Magic. Card tricks. Sleight of hand. The quiet thrill of making someone believe in something impossible for just 1 second. For the host, it wasn't a hobby. It was the closest thing he had to a religion, something sacred that had never once let him down. So when word came that this towering figure was going to step behind the curtain not as an actor, not as a director, but as a magician performing an act of pure mentalism, reading a stranger's mind live on television, the host leaned forward like a kid again. This was supposed to be the moment 2 masters recognized each other. Instead, something broke. The trick stumbled. The timing slipped. The audience didn't know when to gasp, when to laugh, when to believe. A performance built entirely on wonder collapsed in real time in front of millions of people. That alone would have been forgivable. Every magician bombs eventually. Even the greatest ones die on stage sometimes. What could not be forgiven came out only later, quietly, through people close to the production. The audience members chosen for that trick had not been picked at random at all. They had been planted. The answers were already known before the cameras even rolled. The wonder everyone felt watching at home had been manufactured, not earned. To most viewers this would sound like a harmless backstage trick, the kind every performer uses. To the host, it was closer to betrayal. He didn't believe magic was about lying to people. He believed you could trick someone about the method, but never about the awe itself. That feeling had to be real, or the entire art form meant nothing. A rigged audience turned something sacred into a cheap illusion, and that was a line even childhood heroes weren't allowed to cross. There was no dramatic falling out. No public statement. No headline. The calls simply stopped. The invitations quietly disappeared. One of the only men this host had ever truly looked up to became just another name that used to be welcome and suddenly wasn't. He never explained why. He didn't have to. Everyone in that building already understood the rule that had just been broken without a single word being spoken out loud. Joan Rivers. Before any of this, she was just a comic from Brooklyn who kept getting told no. Too sharp, too loud, too much for an industry that didn't know what to do with a woman whose jokes moved faster than the room around her. She spent nearly a decade fighting for stage time nobody wanted to give her. Then one night in the mid-60s, a television host gave her a chance almost nobody else would. And when her set ended, he did something he almost never did on camera. He looked straight into the lens and told the entire country this woman was going to be a star. That single sentence changed her life overnight. The phone started ringing. Doors that had been shut for years suddenly opened. For the next 2 decades, she became something rare in that world, not just a guest but family. She became his most trusted substitute, the first woman ever given permanent permission to sit in his chair when he stepped away. He sent her flowers. He took her to dinner. He defended her in rooms where nobody else would. And she gave him back the only thing she had, complete devotion. Not romantic. Something closer to a daughter who had finally found someone who believed she was real. Then a new network came to her with an offer nobody expected. Her own late-night show. Her own chair. Airing at the exact same time as his. She was in her 50s by then, and she had quietly been told by the people who ran his show that when he eventually stepped down, her name wasn't part of the plan. No long contract. No promise. Just silence about her future. So when someone finally offered her a future of her own, she took it. Her only mistake was timing. She meant to tell him herself, sat by the phone for days trying to find the right words, waited too long to say them. And before she could, the news broke without her. He read about it the same way everyone else did, her name, the rival network, the same time slot, and the fact that the man who built her career had not been told first by the woman he built it for. He never yelled. He never confronted her. He simply stopped. Stopped saying her name on air. Stopped taking her calls. The flowers she sent came back unopened. The private number she used to reach him quietly stopped working. She wasn't pushed out. She was erased. Her new show struggled almost immediately. Some guests were quietly warned that appearing with her meant never appearing with him. It was canceled within a year. Not long after, she lost her husband to a devastating tragedy, and still, every letter she wrote afterward, every attempt to reach the man who once called her a star, went unanswered for the rest of his life. When he passed away years later, she found out from the news like everyone else did. She wouldn't step foot on that stage again until she was 80 years old, invited back by a much younger host who hadn't even been born when she first walked through those doors. She sat down, made the room laugh one more time, and something in her eyes drifted somewhere else entirely. She hadn't lost him because he gave her nothing. She lost him because what he gave her never included a future, and that was the one thing he could never forgive. Jay Leno. He wasn't supposed to be on this list. That's what makes his story so strange. Today his face sits right next to the legend who built the entire world of late-night television. He held that chair for over 2 decades. There are people alive right now who never even saw the man before him host a single episode. But before any of that, he was just a young comic from Boston, standing on that same stage, hoping the most powerful man in comedy would let him come back the following month. And for a while, he did. 4 appearances in a row, each one sharper than the last. The audience liked him. The people booking talent were already penciling his name in for the future. By every visible measure, he was on his way up. Then came a 5th appearance. Same suit, same writers, same 5-minute slot he'd nailed before. But something was different that night. The laughs weren't bad, they just weren't enough. Not silence, just that flat, polite, in-between kind of laughter that most hosts wouldn't even notice. This host noticed everything. According to the man who sat beside him for over 20 years running that show, the reaction afterward was blunt. He just doesn't like him. And once that door closed in this man's mind, it didn't reopen easily. The bookings stopped. No phone call explaining why. No warning. No second chance offered. Just an empty calendar where a growing career used to sit. Imagine being 27 years old and living inside that silence, not knowing what you did wrong, not even sure if you did anything wrong at all, only knowing that the one person whose approval could make or break your entire future had simply moved on without a word. And here's the part that explains everything. This wasn't about jokes landing badly. It was about something the host had chased his entire life. He grew up doing magic tricks at family gatherings just trying to get one real laugh out of a mother who rarely gave him anything close to warmth. That laugh was never just a performance metric to him. It was proof that he mattered. So when a room didn't laugh enough, it wasn't a bad set to him, it was a wound. Years passed. The young comic didn't disappear, he kept working, kept sharpening his timing on the road, filling in constantly for the biggest rival late-night show around. Slowly, quietly, the doors that had shut started opening again. And within a decade and a half, he wasn't just back in the building, he was sitting in the very chair that one thin laugh had almost cost him forever. Which says something strange about power like this. It can freeze you out for years, decades even, but it can't outlast time itself. The same silence that nearly ended a career before it started eventually handed that career the biggest chair in the entire industry. Wayne Newton. To an entire generation, this name might sound unfamiliar today. But back then, this man wasn't just famous. He was royalty. He'd been performing since he was barely a teenager, owned ranches, owned racehorses, his face covered more billboards in that city than anyone else alive. His voice could fill a room without a single microphone. He had a polish about him that made other performers look unfinished by comparison. But that same polish, the perfect hair, the smooth face, the smooth voice, made him an easy, irresistible target for late-night comedy. And for years, one host kept coming back to him in the monologue, night after night. The jokes were never really about his music. They circled something else entirely, his appearance, his masculinity, questions dressed up as punchlines that cut a lot deeper than they looked on the surface. This mattered more than people realized. His audience skewed older, more traditional, more religious. His entire career rested on being seen as a strong, dependable, old-school leading man. Every joke chipped a small crack into that image, and the cracks kept adding up. For almost 2 years, he tried handling it the way the industry expected a man in his position to handle it. Quietly. His agent made calls. His manager reached out to producers. His lawyer sent letters. Nothing changed. The jokes kept coming. So one afternoon, he drove to the studio himself. Parked his own car. Walked in. Took the elevator up. Walked straight down the hallway and opened the office door without knocking. Inside sat the host and his longtime producer. He asked the producer to leave the room. The producer, a man who'd spent his whole career shielding his boss from exactly this kind of moment, took one look at his face and left without arguing. Now it was just the two of them. No cameras. No audience. No band standing by to cut the tension. Just a desk and a silence that had been building for 2 years. What he said next was simple and calm, not shouted, not threatening in tone, just flat and certain. The jokes about him were going to stop today. And if they didn't, he said plainly, he would physically make the host regret it. There was no shouting back. No confrontation. The host simply stood up, taller than the man in front of him, and asked him to leave. He did. The elevator, the lobby, the parking lot, the car door, and it was over. Except it wasn't really over at all. The jokes did stop completely after that day. He'd won that particular fight. But he also became something far rarer in that world, a name the host would simply never invite back into that building again. He didn't lose his place on that show because the host disliked him. He lost it because for one afternoon, he reminded the most powerful man in television that behind the desk, he was just a man too. And that reminder was something he never forgave. Dana Carvey. He never said a single word directly to the man he was about to upset. He never shared a stage with him, never met him face to face, never even sang too long or hijacked a segment. Instead, he did something far more dangerous from thousands of miles away. He held up a mirror. At the time, he was one of the most gifted impressionists working in television, able to become a sitting president, a former president, a stern church lady, and a nasally headbanger all within the same hour, each one so physically precise it felt uncanny. He'd built his entire reputation on finding the smallest, most human tick in a famous person and blowing it up into something the whole country couldn't stop repeating. That fall, his show ran a sketch parodying the biggest late-night program on television. He played the host. The sketch showed an aging man behind a famous desk who didn't quite understand the new world forming just outside his studio walls. He talked a little too long. He laughed a little too hard at his own jokes. He referenced things a younger audience wouldn't even recognize anymore. It wasn't cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was gentle. Because what that sketch was actually doing, what everyone backstage instantly understood the moment it ended, was saying something out loud that nobody had dared say directly yet. The king was getting old. And you have to understand the moment this landed in. A newer, sharper kind of late-night show was rising, one built on irony and self-awareness. Another rival was pulling in a younger, hungrier audience nobody could figure out how to reach anymore. The whole landscape was shifting underneath the throne, even while the throne itself stayed exactly where it always had been. That sketch didn't invent that shift. It simply said it out loud, on the very network that housed the man it was about. And according to people close to the family, the host did not take it well. He felt it made him look out of touch, and once that phrase gets attached to a performer, especially a comedian, it becomes almost impossible to shake. Audiences start hunting for proof of it everywhere they look. Here's what almost nobody outside that building understood. He wasn't afraid of being mocked. He'd spent his whole career mocking other people first. Parody was practically the family business. What he could not tolerate was being told he was finished while he was still very much standing at that desk every single night. So quietly, without any announcement, without any public statement, future appearances simply stopped being offered. No explanation given. No confrontation staged. Just the same kind of silence everyone eventually learned to recognize. He hadn't mocked the man's voice. He'd mocked his expiration date, and the man who had spent 30 years deciding when other people's moments ended wasn't ready to have anyone decide that for him. William Shatner. He walked onto that stage carrying an energy that had nothing to do with nerves. By that point in his career, he was riding the peak of a second wave of fame, a devoted fanbase turning his old space adventures into something close to a religion, a hit cop show pulling solid numbers, a book to promote, a film on the way. He had, in every sense, the command presence of a man used to running the show. He was used to being the center of every camera angle, used to the music swelling the moment he turned his head, used to a bridge that answered to him and him alone. So when he sat down in the guest chair that night, he didn't sit down like a guest. He sat down like he owned the room. What happened over the next few minutes became something close to a lesson in how to lose favor with a man who never once had to raise his voice. First, he simply wouldn't stop talking. For straight minutes, according to people who were there, without giving the host a real opening. Twice the host tried gently stepping in with a joke to steer things back. Both times, he just kept going. Somewhere in the room, someone actually started watching the clock. Then, mid-story, he did something even more damaging. He physically turned his body away from the host and toward another guest sitting beside him, and started directing the entire rest of his story to that man instead. On the monitors, it reportedly looked like an entirely different show happening inside the real one. And as if that weren't enough, he closed out his time by enthusiastically plugging his other television show, one airing on a completely different, competing network, live on the air of the very show hosting him. You could almost feel the temperature drop with each mistake. Nothing showed on camera. The host smiled, thanked him warmly, threw to commercial like nothing had happened. The audience at home walked away thinking it had been a perfectly pleasant appearance. He probably walked away thinking he'd killed it. But somewhere between the green room and the parking lot that night, his name quietly slid into a very different category. He wasn't invited back again for years. What he broke wasn't a rule about content or insults. It was something closer to geometry. That show wasn't really a conversation, it was a piece of choreography, question, answer, rhythm, laugh, recovery, every single night, and everyone in that building understood exactly where the center of gravity belonged. Everyone except a man who'd spent over a decade commanding every scene he ever walked into. On screen he was used to running the ship without asking permission. But that stage belonged to someone else entirely, and forgetting that distinction, even for one appearance, turned out to be a mistake time simply never fully undid. Jerry Lewis. Before any of this, he wasn't just another guest passing through. He was practically part of the family. By the time this incident happened, he'd walked through those studio doors more than 80 times as a guest host, Welcome the way you welcome someone who's been around since before the show even found its footing. He'd built his fame as one half of the most successful nightclub act in the country's history, gone on to direct his own films, produce his own films, and run an annual telethon that raised staggering amounts of money while turning one holiday weekend into something close to a national tradition. He carried honors from entire governments. He was, without exaggeration, the kind of man who changed the temperature of a room just by walking into it. And for years, the doors of that studio stayed permanently open for him. Then, one ordinary week while he was guest hosting, something happened far away from any camera, in a part of the building the audience never saw. It happened in the small room where a man spent every single night writing out lines by hand on giant cue cards, holding them up just off camera to feed dialogue to whoever sat in the host's chair. It was a job that demanded flawless handwriting, perfect timing, and an almost saintly patience, a job done so well for so many years that most viewers never even knew the man existed. According to people who worked there at the time, during a last-minute script change, that man couldn't get the card rewritten fast enough. And the guest host, according to multiple accounts, became verbally abusive toward him in front of the rest of the crew, humiliating him over something completely out of his control. The card man went to the real host the next day, calm and direct, and said simply that he didn't want to work with that guest again. In most rooms, that conversation ends in 30 seconds with a forced apology and everyone moving on. This host didn't work that way. He listened. He nodded. He thanked the man for telling him the truth. And then he quietly picked up the phone. A man with 80 prior appearances, a man practically considered family, someone who could have walked into that building on any night of the week, simply disappeared from the schedule. No guest hosting again. Almost no appearances at all for the rest of that show's run. The doors didn't slam shut dramatically. They just quietly stopped opening. What this really revealed was something people outside that building rarely understood. This wasn't about protecting an ego. It was about protecting the people who built the show brick by brick every single night, the card man, the camera operators, the crew nobody ever saw on screen. He owed them everything, and he knew it completely. So when a star treated one of them like furniture, it wasn't a small backstage squabble to him. It was a violation of the only deal that ever really mattered, the one between him and the people who made him look effortless.